Okay, today we're doing Siman Kuf. I don't know why it's on this slide, but anyhow, Siman Kuf, Sef Aleph. We're talking about Beryah. And as sort of like an introduction, Bitul, which is what we've been talking about a lot. Bitul means this thing is like so unimportant that it doesn't make a difference, doesn't affect everything else. So there's all different types of Bitul. There's Bitul Baroiv and Bitul Bashishim, all different types of Bitul. But there are some things that are so important, or they play such an important role in the food that they can't be batal. Batal means it's like unimportant, and if this thing is it inherently is important, or it makes a big difference in the food, then it can't be batal. Today we're going to talk about one of those, which is Beryah. In the way back, we spoke about Davar HaMaimed. It's a different type of one, and I have a bunch here that we're going to talk about going forward. Pretty soon about Chaticha Rulis Kaved. Then in Siman Kuf Beis, Davishesh Matirin. In Siman Kuf Beis also about Chazusa, and then way at the end in Siman Kuf Yud about Davachoshav, Davishav Minyan. Okay, so those are all different types of things that either they're very important or they play such an important role that the word Bitul doesn't sort of make sense. Okay, so now about what we're talking about, which is Beryah. It says it here in Shulchan Aruch that a Beryah can't be batal. I'm going to talk in a minute. Roughly, we'll say a Beryah means a whole thing, but we'll talk about in a second what that means. And the Gemara says this din for a very, very specific case, which is not at all negaya to us. The Gemara says it in Gitanasha, and the Gemara doesn't say very much at all. The Gemara just says that Gitanasha is Beryah and it can't be batal. Okay, and not so relevant to us. When we have a Gitanasha, it's going to be batal on something, not so relevant. But the din of Beryah is also negaya to another din, with there's many more Gemaras about that, and that is if you eat a Beryah of something that's Asur, then you get Malkos, even though usually Malkos needs that you should have to eat a kazayas. But the din is if you eat a Beryah of something, then you get Malkos for that thing. Okay, there's much more discussion, as you'll hear more about those kind of cases than about ours. And the Rishonim hold that those things are the same. They're connected. Whatever is considered a Beryah for Malkos is what's considered a Beryah for Bitul. And there are those who even understand that they're connected to each other. That it's because a Beryah you get Malkos for eating the Beryah. That in itself is the reason why Chazal said that it can't be batal. Midrash almost all hold that Beryah is batal. Midrash would be batal, but Midrabanan it's not batal. And its chashivas is since you get Malkos for eating this thing. That in itself gives a certain chashivas to it, different than other things like a chaticha rulis kabed. That in itself has an inherent chashivas. Here the chashivas is that since in din it has a chashivas because you would get malchus for eating if you ate this thing. Therefore, that has a chashivas. And for that reason, it can't be batal also. Okay. I'll just mention now. It's going to come up again later. Is that even though this din that Beryah is not batal is a drabanan. It's all a Rabbanan idea. Even so, most assume, like the Taz brings it, most people assume that it even works even if the Isser itself is an Isser Rabbanan. Okay, even if so we don't call two Rabbanans, even if the thing itself is an Isser Rabbanan, we assume Beryah is not bottled for that also. It's kamat impossible to find a case like that. Okay, once we hear the rules of what makes something into a Beryah, that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute. It's really hard to find an example of an Issa Drabanan, which is also a Beryah. But in theory, anyhow, such a thing that if an Issa Drabanan would be a Beryah, we would say it wouldn't be Batal either. Okay, so I'm going to tell you, the place can be now that I see at least 6 cases, okay, two of which we are considered a Beryah, and 4 of them are not considered a Beryah. And then we're going to try to, and from those come out the 4 different rules about what is a Beryah and what's not considered a Beryah. Okay, so 6 cases like this. The first one is one I told you already is Gitanasha. That's the one case that the Gemara says is not batal. The Beryah is not batal. The one case that I know of that the Gemara says it says that for is for Gitanasha. Everything else is not for Bitul. Another case the Gemara says is for Malkos is if you eat a live bird. Or a live bug. I don't know if a bird could be that small, but if you have whatever, then you get malchus for eating it's a kazayas. If the bird is dead, then that's not considered a Beryah. The next case is if you have chalev, the They're talking about Bitul, Chaylev could be Batal. Now for this, the poskim will talk about it, that Chaylev could be Batal even if it's a Beryah. I looked high and low and cannot find such a Gemara. I'm sure it's someplace because everybody keeps talking about it that it is. What I mean is there's places where it says that Chaylev could be Batal, but it didn't say that the Chaylev was a Beryah. The Chaylev could be Batal. That is in many places that yes, Chaylev, certain fats that are also could be Batal, but to say that Chaylev that's a Beryah could be Batal, I didn't see any place that says that. Everyone seems to assume that it can be. I'm not sure where that.
So you're telling me Chaylev is a Beryah?
They're saying
Chaylev is not a
Beryah. They're saying it, even though Chaylev should be a Beryah, even so we see that it could be Batal. So I'm saying, where did you see a Gemara that says Chaylev, which is a Beryah, can be Batal? Okay, to which we're going to make rules out of it. We're going to say by the fact that a Chaylev that's a Beryah could be Batal, therefore that proves, you'll hear what in a second, it proves something. Together with Chaylev comes, they also mention, what am I missing? Orla and Klaya Kerem. That I saw. That I found Makoris that said that Orla and Klaya Kerem that are a Beryah, they could be Batal. I got it, no problem. So then I got that. But we didn't say that Chaylev that's a Beryah could be Batal. I couldn't find the Gemara. Maybe there is, but I couldn't find it.
We're talking about Terubas Yavish, obviously, right? And Giranosha and Chaylev.
Yes.
It wouldn't be a Beryah anymore. So
correct. Yes, it will be Yavish. So like Giranosha, they say, what's the case? They have a bunch of Gidin. I don't know which one is a Giranosha, which one's not a Giranosha. To me, they all look the same. Gidin looks like a Gid. I don't know which one it is. Okay, so something like that. Okay. The next case is Ashar and Iskal. The Gemara says there's actually talking about Bitul. It could be Bitul into other kachim. The last case is a wheat kernel. There, it's in Malkos that is not considered a Beryah. Okay, so these are 6 cases. Two that are considered Beryahs, and 4 that are not considered Beryahs. And now we'll make some sense of these cases like this. Okay, so the first like this. From the fact that a Giranosha is considered a Beryah, but a wheat kernel is not considered a Beryah, that tells us a rule that in order to be considered a Beryah, it has to come from a living thing. Okay, the reason why the wheat kernel is not a Beryah, wheat kernel is a whole thing. One wheat kernel is a whole thing. How is that different than the Giranosha? So that we say is the fact that the Giranosha comes from a living thing tells us that you can only be considered a Beryah if you come from something that's living. Okay, not as opposed to a wheat kernel comes from a plant that's not considered to be living. Okay, so what would be an example of a, just for our understanding of a wheat kernel that would be Asur, would be like a wheat kernel that's Chodesh would be Asur. Now for Chodesh, it usually has a different reason why it can't be Batal because Davashesh Matirin. Berry is a little stronger than Davashesh Matirin, but okay. But a better example in Yaninu anyhow for us is that if you have eggs, if an insect lays an egg, that egg, so the egg is Asur, but it's not considered a Beryah because there's no living being in there. It's just an egg, so it's not considered a living thing. So that's one of the reasons. I'll tell you another one in a minute. That's one of the reasons why an egg laid by an insect is not considered a Beryah. Okay. So the first rule is that it has to be all the rules that I'm telling you are all brought in Shulchan Aruch. I'm just telling you how they come from and just helping bring it out. Okay, it has to come from a living thing. Okay, and the second is the fact that a live bird is considered a Beryah, but a dead bird or a Shar Niskal is not. Now those all came from living things. Okay, so what's the reason why the live bird is considered a Beryah, but the dead bird or the Shar Niskal are not? And that tells us is because the live bird was Asur always. Okay, it's always been treif, as opposed to the dead bird. The reason why it's Asur is because it's a nevela or a Shar Niskal is because it did something wrong, and therefore it has to. It became Asur later in life. At a later point, it became Asur. So that tells us this rule that something's only buried if it's Asur Mitchilas Brios. It has to have always been Asur. So for us, that's a very real example. The real thing that's Asur Mitchilas Brios for us is a bug. Okay, bugs are Asur, always Asur. They don't become Asur. It's not like an nevela that when it was alive it was mutter, and then when it got killed it became a nevela. The bug was always Asur. Okay, so for that point, I'm going to remind you. Of something we talked about in Siman Pedalad in Hilchos Talem, that Rosh Kluger asks. He says most bugs are not Asur until they're Sharetz al Aretz. So that means is when the bug was born, it was mutter to eat it, and then a minute later it was Sharetz al Aretz. It became Asur. He says so not all bugs, but most bugs. So therefore, he says it's not Asur Mitchilas Barasai. So he wants to say, so therefore maybe bugs could be Bitul. They don't not considered a Beryah. They could be Bitul and other things because they're missing this rule. They're not Asur Mitchilas Barasai because they it took a second till they became Asur. They were born mutter. Okay, so when we spoke about it then, I told you two answers. I'm just going to repeat them quickly, and that is one is like this. One is from the Chavastas, and he says this: the rule is not when we say Asur Mitchilas Barasai, doesn't mean that from the very first second of its life it was Asur. That's not the point of it. The point of it is that it was inherently Asur. There's something about it that makes it Asur. So a bug is inherently Asur. As opposed to a Shara Niskel, the Shara Niskel is not inherently Asur. Something happened later on that made it become Asur. So sort of like an outside factor that caused it to be Asur. So Asur Mitchilas Barasai, the Chavastas says, doesn't mean it's Asur from the first second it was alive. It means there's something inherent to it. An Avela, it's not inherently Asur. It was mutter, and then it became an Avela. Something happened, so to speak, from the outside that caused it to be Asur. As opposed to a treif bird was always Asur. A bug was always Asur. So the fact that it takes a second till the Isur starts happening makes no difference. The point is that it became from, it's inherent to the thing that it was Asur. That's the Chavastas answer. Pri Megadan says a different answer. He says that when we say that a bug is not Asur until it's sheretz al haaretz, that means is because until then the bug is considered part of the vegetable. Okay, so it's not a bug yet. It doesn't become a bug till it separates from the vegetable, so to speak. The vegetable is mutter. The bug on it, as when it's born, is considered vegetable. When it starts to move, then it becomes non-vegetable and becomes its own thing. And now it's its own thing, it's Asur. So he says it is Asur Mitchilas Barasai. As soon as it became a bug, it became Asur. Before it was a bug, when it was part of the vegetable, it's mutter. And Rabbi Gissin just said, because of that, he says it's so, if a person eats a bug that was never sheretz al haaretz, he has such a bug that was not sheretz al haaretz, and he eats it, he's no timtum alev. He didn't eat a bug. He ate a vegetable. And it looks like a bug to you, but it's not a bug. If the Torah says until it's sheretz al haaretz, it's not considered a bug. He says so. There's no timtum alev either. I didn't eat a bug. I ate a sheretz. I ate a vegetable.
Well, that was the prize. It's not.
No, because that's a shiloh. Because that in itself is a shiloh.
It's not a question of Bitul.
That's a shiloh. Whether there's timtum alev, if it wasn't also yet, but it's really the same bug. Oh, you mean because it wasn't even Isser altogether? Okay, you can say it like that. Fine, no problem. Okay, next. Fine. Number 3. The fact, now we have these two things that are considered barriers, and chaylev, now chaylev comes from a living thing, and it's also Mitchilas Barasai, right? The chaylev that you have is also, so seemingly chaylev should be considered a barrier. So why is chaylev not considered, again, I don't know where it comes from, but how do we know that chaylev is not, why is chaylev not considered Barasai? So the answer to that is that that has to do with we dig a little deeper to understand why is it that a person gets Malkos for eating a Beryah. Okay? Why is it that you get Malkos for a Beryah, even though usually eating to be over an Isser of eating, you have to eat a Kazayas. So what's special about eating a Beryah? So the pshat is like this. When the Torah says you have to eat, that means you have to eat a Kazayas. When the Torah says don't eat this, let's say it says don't eat a Chazer. Okay, so then it's understood that if I eat the chazer, I'm for sure for the Isser. I didn't do the eat if it wasn't a kazayas big, but if I ate the chazer, the Torah says don't eat chazer, and this is one of those. So then I'm eating the thing. Okay, so it says don't eat a sheretz. If I eat a sheretz, even though it's not kazayas big, I didn't do the word eat because eat means kazayas, but I did sheretz. I did eating towards a sheretz. That's considered to be an Isser, and I get Malkos. Even though I didn't eat a kazayas worth. What would usually, if I have to eat matzah, I have to eat kazayas worth, but for here I ate a sheretz, so I'm considered to eat the whole thing. So that's true when the Torah answered the thing. It said don't eat a sheretz, and this thing is a sheretz. And but if the Torah just said something else, the Torah didn't say don't eat the sheretz. It gave it in a more vague term. It didn't point at the thing and say don't eat that thing. Then I have to eat a kazayas worth. So the way we know whether the Torah answered the specific thing or it's more vague, is based on this rule of im yachalek ein shmo alav. What would happen if we split it in half? So if we split the sheretz in half, then we'd say I have a half a sheretz. I didn't eat this. This isn't a sheretz. It's only half a sheretz. The Torah says don't eat a sheretz, and this is only half a sheretz. But when the Torah says don't eat chaylev, if I split a piece of chaylev in half, It's still both chaylev. There's no difference in how we refer to it. We don't call a half of a piece of chaylev. So therefore, this is not when the Torah says don't eat chaylev. This is not, so to speak, eating a whole piece of chaylev, meaning eating the whole chaylev hamachas hakerav. If you had one that was less than a kazayis, which of course is impossible. If you had one that was less than a kazayis, you wouldn't say I ate a whole chaylev, because if you broke that chaylev in half, it would still be half of a chaylev. Okay, so even though I try to explain, I'm not sure I understand it completely. But anyhow, such is the rule that we have something that if we split it in half, doesn't have the same name, like chaylev. When we split it, it has the same name. It's chaylev, and two pieces of chaylev don't have any different name to them. That's considered not a Beryah. A gid anasha, if we split it in half, we say we have half the gid anasha. I used to have a whole gid anasha, now I have a half a gid anasha. I don't have the thing anymore, so that's not considered a Beryah. Now back to then is a Beryah. So right, im yichog ein shmoy alav, that is considered a Beryah. Okay, that makes it now.
So there's a chaylev gid anasha and a chaylev hamachas hakerav or something. Whatever.
Right, because the Torah doesn't say don't eat chaylev hamachas hakerav. If it would have said that, then we would say that this is half of the chaylev hamachas hakerav. It doesn't say that. The Torah says don't eat chaylev. And we know that there are different types of chaylev, and one of them is the chaylev hamachas hakerav. That's right, because really that's by karbanos. The Torah just says don't eat chaylev. Don't eat any chaylev. So this is just a piece of chaylev. A bigger piece or a small piece don't have any different names to them. They're all chaylev. As opposed to when Torah says don't eat gid anasha, it pointed at a specific thing. It says don't eat that. If I eat that, then I was over, even if that thing happens to not be a kazakh. Now, so Rosh Hashanah said that's another reason why the bug eggs are not considered berries. Okay, because the Torah never says don't eat bug eggs. The reason why not eat bug eggs is because they're yotzim min hatamei. Okay, there's no inherent isser to bug eggs. The isser is because it's yotzim min hatamei. So when I have it, if I would cut it in half, I wouldn't say this is a partial yotze. It's the same yotze as it was beforehand. But there's nothing inherent to the piece that says this egg is the yotzim min hatamei. No, half an egg is also yotzim min hatamei. That name, the isser, is not bug eggs. The Torah didn't say don't eat bug eggs. The Torah said eat yotzim min hatamei, and this is the same thing. Okay, so those are the first three rules. Okay, now.
And this is supposed to stem for Malkos also, right? Not stem for Berachos.
We're going to get the Berachos at the end. But you're right. The Ikar is Malkos. Most of these rules are from Malkos. The only Gemara that really is about Beryah for Bitul is about gid anasha. Okay? We have to draw everything else from the Malkos. Everything else, I think I said it right before you walked in. We pull everything else from the Malkos stuff. Everything comes from the Malkos stuff. There's almost nothing about
I thought I remember from Mishnah Malkos that talks about berries being even botanical things.
So there's a machlokes in the Mishnah about wheat kernels. That's a machlokes in the Mishnah. We paskin it's not. That's the wheat kernel case. If we paskin, it's not considered buried. Okay. Anyhow, maybe I'm wrong. Okay. Anyhow, last. Okay. The last is the most obvious rule of being a Beryah is that it has to be complete. Okay, and that is when we look at the cases that are what is considered a Beryah, gid anasha and a live bird are considered a Beryah. So it is understood and it's sort of built in that it has to be something complete. Now. Back when we learned Terloim, I'm going to mention two things from back then from Hilchos Terloim that we took. Of course, Beryah come up over there. That is like this: Le'inyan Malkos for a Beryah. The Gemara, it's a Gemara in Nazir. Wants to know is how much does something have to be missing before it's not considered a Beryah? Does it mean it's not missing anything? If it's missing even anything, that makes it not considered a Beryah, or does it have to be missing an Eresh hanashama tluya by? It has to be missing something that it couldn't live without this thing. Like it's missing. I don't know. Pick a piece of a bug that it wouldn't live without it. But let's say it's missing a leg, can live without a leg. So then that would make it. That's a machlokes in the Gemara. Which one it is? The Gemara is talking about le'inyan Malkos, as most of these dinim are. The Rishonim understand that it's the same din, has the same. It also affects the shaila about what's considered a Beryah for Bitul. And the Shach says, since the Gemara is not partial to shaila, and since in Bitul is only Drabanan, the fact that a Beryah can't be Bitul is only Drabanan, Memela, we would say we could be Makel and say that even if it's missing something, still you could it could be Bitul. Still, it could be Bitul as long as it's missing anything, even if it's missing Eresh and Hanasham Tluyi. Okay. Second is that the Bishesha brings Hagar Sharidura that what happens if you cook a fish he's talking about, a tray fish, and while you're cooking it, some of the fish shrinks or dissolves as part of the cooking process, but it's normal part of the cooking process. So he says that's still considered a Beryah because that's normal. That's how you do it when you cook a fish. Some of it falls off and some of it shrinks. That's considered to be a Beryah. The Magen Avram says that there's a Malkos Rishonim about that shaila, and the Mishnah Berurah says that we should be makel about that. Okay, so even if it loses things as part of its cooking, we could be makel, and that's not considered a Beryah either. Okay, so we have these two kulas about making a Beryah. That first is even if it's missing something, and second is even if that happens as part of the cooking, the normal part of cooking that would be missing a piece, that's not considered a Beryah. And because of these rules, because of those two kulas, there are times that there's going to be kulas about something being bottle after we cook it or puree it, because we're assuming or we're chayshish or we know that pieces fall off. Okay, so you're saying okay. Okay, so whatever, in all these kind of cases, so depending on how much you did and how usher it was, and all kinds of different rules that are not for today, so then potentially we could say this Bitul is possible because of these kind of rules that we can lose piece in this and that. Okay, some other details about Beryah. I told you already that Beryah is not Bitul, which is a Drabanan, works even if the issue would be an issue Drabanan. I told you it's not such a realistic shaila, but anyhow, there's such a thing. But since it's a Drabanan, so if a person is mesupik whether something is a Beryah or not, you could be makel and assume it was not a Beryah. Now the Taz says that's only true if you're mesupik if the thing is a Beryah or if it's not a Beryah. Like in our cases where you cooked up the food and you're not sure if you lost a piece of if part of the bug's legs fell off or didn't fall off. So you're mesupik if it's a Beryah. But what happens if you know it's a Beryah, but you're mesupik if it's aser or not? He says then that doesn't count over here. You know what I mean? Even you're saying, well, even if it would be aser, the only reason why it's not Bitul is because it's a Beryah. So really, my shayla is a Drabanan. And at the end of the day, my shayla is on a Drabanan because it would have been Bitul b'shishim. The only reason to not be Bitul is because it's a Beryah. So he says no. He says because there the ikar shayla is on the deraisa, which is that thing aser or was it mutter, and therefore the deraisa says safek deraisa l'chumra it was aser. Once it was aser, then the fact that it's a Beryah doesn't make. Now with the Rabbanan, it's not Bitul because it's a Beryah, and then we don't look at that as a safek Rabbanan. The only time it is if we're mesupik, like a miskalgal, yes. But the only when we're mesupik, if it's a Beryah, we know it would be aser. We just don't know if it was a Beryah. Then the shayla is on the Rabbanan, then we could be making. Okay, some Rishonim say that when we say that a Beryah is not Bitul, it could be Bitul if it's Bitul in 960 times its volume. Such a shita. The Mechaber says not true, and that's why the Mechaber says I feel be'elef loy betela. It's not just an exaggeration. He's trying to say it's not 960. Okay, youth might think 960s. No, I feel be'elef loy betela means is to say it's not like that shita. Sometimes people are mitzvah such a shita, but be'ik we don't pass like that. Okay. Okay. A Beryah is not Bitul min b'mina or min b'she'eni minoi. But it's only the Beryah itself that's not Bitul. If we somehow could get the Beryah out and we're just left with the top of the Beryah, then it's not a problem. Okay, we only have to worry about the Beryah itself. And even mimish any minoi. But if we get the Beryah out, then we're okay and it could be Bitul. And Memela, now that's not such a realistic case. How did I get the Beryah out? That I should say that I got the Beryah out, but I got. Okay, I guess so. I guess that could happen. Okay, but for us, it's like is that if I cook something and that food it was not Bitul because it was a Beryah inside of it, I don't have to kasher the kalim. Okay, because there it's only a shaila of the Blios. Okay, that's more lamaisa for me. I had a bug in the food. The food is also because it has a Beryah in it and it can't be. I can't eat the food because there's a Beryah inside of it. Okay, that's very nice for the food, but for the pot is just only a shaila of berries, or only a shaila of Blios, and therefore we don't have to worry about that. Okay, and this is what you said before, Yossi, is that the din of Beryah is also negated to Hilchas Berachos, which is you don't make a bracha achrona until you eat a kazayis, unless you eat a kazayis of potatoes or whatever it was. But the Mechaber says that there are some who hold that eating a Beryah also makes a person have to make a bracha achrona also. That's just like for these other dinim, it's also such a thing. He says it's a shaila, and you should therefore avoid eating a Beryah, which is unless you eat a kazayis. So for this, in that context, in Hilchas Brachos, everybody says that the rules are very different than what you have here on the screen here. These 4 different rules. Okay, it doesn't make a difference if it's from the first 2 rules make no difference, whether it's from a living thing or atzim mitchilas b'rasai, yachalek and shema alav makes no difference. All that makes difference is whether it's complete. The examples that are given there, you'll hear this rule is a grape, a cherry, a bean, or a small fish. Okay, who don't meet all of those rules. And the one and only rule is that it has to be complete. But I just throw in the Mishmur says. The Ramah sort of says, but the Mishmur explains that if you have something that you have let's say a cherry that has in it a pit that you can't eat, that's not considered a Beryah. If you eat just the cherry, if you eat the pit, then you are over. But if you eat the part without, even though the pit is inedible, and if you didn't eat the pit, you didn't eat the Beryah.
In 2 parts.
What do you say?
In 2 parts.
You mean half first and then the second half afterwards?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's not the right because more.
How could it be?
Why?
You didn't eat a Beryah. No.
You're saying you eat in total? I ate the whole cherry.
You ate I don't say you cut a cherry in half, then you eat 2 halves. It's no, not a chance.
Okay, so I know the answer. I don't know the answer. Okay.